Although we can thus send our thoughts, it must not be assumed that our minds are as an open book for all to read. By no means. We can, if we so will, deliberately keep our thoughts to ourselves. But if we should think idly, as it were, if we should just let our thoughts ramble along under a loose control, and then they can be seen and read by others. One of the first things to be done upon arrival here is to realize that thought is concrete, that it can create and build, and then our next effort is to place our own thoughts under proper and adequate control. But like so much else in the spirit world, we can soon learn to adjust ourselves to the new conditions if we have a mind to do so, and we shall never lack the most willing helpers in any of all of our difficulties. The latter, Ruth and I, had already found out with relief and gratitude. Ruth was by now very impatient to be off to visit the city. She insisted that Edwin should take us there immediately, and so without further delay, we rose up from the grass, and with a word from our guide, we set forth. Halls of Learning. As we approached the city, it was possible for us to gather some idea of its extensive proportions. It was, I hardly need say, totally unlike anything I had yet seen. It consisted of a large number of stately buildings, each of which was surrounded with magnificent gardens and trees, with here and there pools of glittering water, clear as crystal, yet reflecting every shade of color known to earth, with many other tints to be seen nowhere but in the realms of spirit. It must not be imagined that these beautiful gardens bore the slightest resemblance to anything to be seen upon the earth plane. Earthly gardens, at their best and finest, are of the very poorest by comparison with these that we now beheld, with their wealth of perfect colorings and their exhalations of heavenly perfumes. To walk upon the lawns with such a profusion of nature about us held us spellbound. I had imagined that the beauty of the countryside, wherein I had had all my experience of spirit lands so far, could hardly be excelled anywhere. My mind had reverted to the narrow streets and crowded pavements of the earth, the buildings huddled together because space is so valuable and costly, the heavy, tainted air made worse by streams of traffic. I had thought of hurry and turmoil, and all the restlessness of commercial life, and the excitement of passing pleasure. I had no conception of a city of eternal beauty, as far removed from an earthly city as the light of day is from black night. Here were fine, broad thoroughfares of emerald green lawns in perfect cultivation, radiating like the spokes of a wheel from a central building which, as we could see, was the hub of the whole city. There was a great shaft of pure light descending upon the dome of this building, and we felt instinctively, without Edwin having to tell us, that in this temple we could together send up our thanks to the great source of all, and that there we should find none other than the glory of God in truth. The buildings were not of any great height as we should measure and compare with earthly structures, but they were for the most part extremely broad. It is impossible to tell of what material they were composed because they were essentially spirit fabrics. The surface of each smooth as a marble, yet it had the delicate texture and translucence of alabaster, while each building sent forth, as it were, into the adjacent air, a stream of light of the palest shade of coloring. Some of the buildings were carved with designs of foliage and flowers, and others were left almost unadorned, as far any similar devices were concerned, relying upon their semi-classic nature for relief. And over all was the light of heaven shining evenly and uninterruptedly, so that nowhere were there dark places. The city was devoted to the pursuit of learning, to the study and practice of the arts, and to the pleasures of all in this realm. It was exclusive to none, but free for all to enjoy with equal right. Here it was possible to carry on so many of those pleasant and fruitful occupations that had been commenced on the earth plane. Here, too, many souls could indulge in some agreeable diversion which had been denied them for a variety of reasons whilst they were incarnate. The first hall that Edwin took us into was concerned with the art of painting. This hall was of very great size and contained a long gallery, on the walls of which were hanging every great masterpiece known to man. They were arranged in such a way that every step of earthly progress could be followed in proper order, beginning with the earliest times and so continuing down to the present day. Every style of painting was represented, gathered from all points of the earth. It must not be thought that such a collection as we were now viewing is only of interest and service to people who have a full appreciation and understanding of the painter's art. Such could not be further from the case. There was a goodly number of people in the gallery when we entered, some of whom were moving about wherever their fancy took them. But there were many groups listening to the words of able teachers who were demonstrating the various phases in the story of art as exemplified upon the walls, and they were at the same time giving such a clear and interesting exposition that none could fail to understand. A number of these pictures I recognized, as I had seen their originals in the Earth galleries. Ruth and I were astonished that Edwin told us that what we had seen in those galleries were not the originals at all. We were now seeing the originals for the first time. What we had seen was an earthly counterpart, which was perishable from the usual causes, for example, from fire or the general disintegration through the passage of time. But here we were viewing the direct results of the thoughts of the painter, created in the etheric before he actually transferred those thoughts to his earthly canvas. It could be plainly observed in many cases where the earthly picture fell short of that which the painter had in his mind. He had endeavored to reproduce his exact conception, but through physical limitations, this exact conception had eluded him. In some instances, it has been the pigments that had been at fault, when in the early times the artist had been unable to procure or evolve the particular shade of color he wanted. But though he lacked physically, his mind had known precisely what he wished to do. He had built it up in the spirit, the result of which we were now able to see, while he had failed to do so on the material canvas. That was one major difference that I noticed in the pictures by comparison with what I'd seen on the earth plane. Another great point of this similarity, and the most important, was the fact that here all these pictures were alive. It is impossible to convey any idea of this paramount difference. These spirit pictures must be seen here to understand it. I can only just suggest an idea. These pictures, then, whether landscape or portrait, were never flat. That is, they did not seem to have been painted upon a flat canvas. They possessed, on the other hand, all the completeness of relief. The subject stood forth almost as though it were a model where one could take hold of all the elements that went to the making up of the subject of the picture. One felt that the shadows were real shadows cast by real objects. The colors glowed with life, even among the very early works, before much progress had been made. A problem came to my mind for a solution of which I naturally turned to Edwin. It was this: as it would be undesirable, perhaps, as well as impractical, to hang in these galleries every painting that emanated from the earth plane, any idea of preferential treatment based upon the judgment of others did not seem quite consonant with spirit law, insofar as I was acquainted with it. What system is used for the selection of paintings to hang upon the walls? I was told that it was a question that is frequently asked by visitors to this gallery. The answer is that by the time an artist, whether he is good, bad, or just commonplace, has adjusted himself to his new life, he has no further illusions, if he ever harbored any, of his own work. Usually an extreme diffidence sets in, fostered by the immensity and the superlative beauty of this realm, so that in the end the problem becomes one of scarcity rather than superabundance. When we gazed at the portraits of so many men and women whose names had worldwide fame, whether they lived in distant times or in the present day, it gave Ruth and me a strange feeling to think that we were now inhabitants of the same world as they, and that they, like ourselves, were very much alive, and not mere historical figures in the chronicles of the earth world. In other parts of this same building were rooms wherein students of art could learn all that there is to be learnt. The joy of these students is great in their freedom from their earthly restrictions and bodily limitations. Here instruction is easy, and the acquisition and application of knowledge equally facile to those who wish to learn. Gone are all the struggles of the student in the surmounting of earthly difficulties, both of the mind and of the hands, and progress toward proficiency is consequently smooth and rapid. The happiness of all the students whom we saw itself spread happiness to all who beheld it, for there is no limit to their endeavors when that bugbear of earthly life, fleeting time, and all the petty vexations of the mundane existence have been abandoned forever. Is there any wonder that artists within this hall, and indeed in every hall in the city, were enjoying the golden hours of their spiritual reward?